You have to be an independent thinker because only you can develop your own principles based on your own values. This brings me to my first and most fundamental principle, which is that you need to think for yourself about what is true. The greatest tragedy of mankind, or the greatest tragedy of individuals who together make up mankind in their dealing with each other, is they have bottled up in their heads wrong opinions that they don't know how to stress test, because they think if it's in their heads, it's right, if they have an opinion. And it's so easy to get around that if you can think about, how do I go beyond that? So the reason I'm saying that is I love partnerships in which there's a back and forth and you knock things around and you get to the right answer, where there's open-mindedness and learning at the same time as there's the assertiveness as you're trying to figure things out together. In all relationships, in one way or another, you have to find out how you're going to make decisions. There are going to be agreements and disagreements, and you have to have the art of thoughtful disagreement. Now, people find their domains differently. Maybe somebody says, oh, okay, I'll take care of these things and you take care of that. I don't know. Some people, the traditional household might say, okay, I'll take care of making the money out, and the man goes out and he makes money in the world. And then when woman says, I'll take care of the kids, we're not there anymore. But each role, I'm trying to say, in some way, you have to find out how to do the art of thoughtful disagreement. And it makes sense. And then also knowing what's good, what you're good at, and what you're not good at. It's a good thing to know what you're good at and what you're not good at. There's a life cycle, right? Your teens, your 20s, your 30s, and so on. And every phase is a little bit different, or quite a bit different. And people have asked me in their 20s, what is good advice for their 20s?
You are about to go independent. You were dependent on others, and now others are going to become dependent on you, and you're going to work, and you're going to learn, and you're going to try to be successful. This whole different phase in your life, the best thing I can say is make your work and your passion the same thing, and don't forget about the money part. Okay, now you're in a different phase of your life. You're in the phase of your life that your job is getting more serious, your responsibilities are going to get more serious, perhaps your relationships are going to get more serious. This is a stage of your life where you might be choosing a partner, and you might be having children. And as you're choosing a partner and having children, you're going to deal with the work-life balance issue. And so the bit of advice that I want to convey at that is that you can look at that as, oh, I have to choose between giving up my work hours and I have to choose to have a quality of life. You have to choose less. If you know how to get more of out of an hour, you can have more life in life. And so that there are things that you can do, and in my book Principles, I wrote some of those things down, that you can be more efficient, more effective, and you can get more out of life, so the trade-off is less.
Okay, what would I recommend? First of all, I recommend for every phase of your life, meditation. If you can meditate and you have the calmness and the equanimity to look at that, I think that that's an important thing. And then I think also that if you think about the relationships that you're in, that then may be more strained, to differentiate those relationships. Who are the people that you want to be around, and how do you work with them to get you through those issues? Meditation is the biggest gift that I can give anyone. And I would say more than anything, it is whatever reason for success I've had. Because it allows one, back to the two U's, I'll clarify. What I mean is that in your mind, we think, what do you want? And the reality is, when you look at the neuroscience and psychology, that there are different parts of your brain that want different things. And so in the simplest sense, there is the logical part of your brain that you're conscious of, it's called the conscious, and you think you're being logical and you want to make those decisions. And then there's the subliminal, below the limbic system, part of the brain, which is the emotional, and it's not as conscious to you, but it has more of an influence on you than really the logical one. And so they're not aligned. And so when you're experiencing that pain, or let's say the ego, right, there were two main things. You got an ego barrier and a blind spot barrier. If you can get past your ego barrier and you get past your blind spot barrier, you can accomplish anything, because you'll also know that you don't have to do everything, you don't have to figure it out yourself. You can take in from other people the different ways to approach things in the best possible way. And so the realization that we all are really struggling with ourselves, and to think which is in control. Meditation helps to deal with the alignment of those two things, because both are valuable. In other words, intuition, imagination, the things we really love come from our subliminal us's, right? Our needs, whatever they may be. They come from here, that subliminal. They may be valuable. They may be damaging. You don't know the difference. And so when they come up and you're looking at those with your logical mind and you can align those things, you're probably in good shape. If you can do that alignment between the subliminal and the logical, and you can do that with other people, so that you can triangulate with other people and say, does that make sense? And get alignment. That alignment is the path to the future, because you only have to know what the best things to do are. You don't have to have them all come up from your head. And for God's sakes, don't be overly opinionated, because just because you have that opinion, it doesn't mean it's true. So that's where the two U's and the alignment really is so important.
Give me a couple things that I can do to get more out of a minute.
First of all, if you do make your passion and your work the same thing, then it's great, right? Because your passion, whatever it might be, you're a painter or you're an entrepreneur and whatever that is, and you find that more enjoyable than going to a ball game, let's say, then that becomes a passionate thing. That's one thing. Second, to know how to work with people who can do things really well to get the most leverage out of people, okay? Third, how do you get yourself really, what are the right work habits? Anyway, there's a whole bunch of those kinds of things where how do I, what you say, how do I get it done without me doing it? Who's the best to do it, and how do I get it? And all of a sudden you open yourself up to all different possibilities of how you can do that, right? No time. Struggle well, or tough love. Okay, I put those words together because that exemplifies the fact that people don't think they go together. And so if you start to realize struggling well is what will get you what you want, okay, rather than avoiding struggle, that's what I'm trying to convey. And so if you realize that, then you will go to the struggle. You won't be averse to the struggle. And you will think, and then under that in the book, I wrote all these different ways of what it means to struggle well, okay? How you have thoughtful disagreement, how you listen to maybe you're not good at that or not, how you learn, how you navigate all the ways through that so that you get stronger. Because if you don't struggle, you won't get stronger, okay? So struggling well, go above it, okay, struggling well, a big element is to go above your struggle, just like you did. You look back and say, okay, am I struggling well, rather than be in it and doing those things. So there are a lot of different ways of how to struggle well, but if you know, okay, that struggling is a good thing. Okay, if you want to be strong, it's a good thing. If you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you have to worry. Okay? Because what I mean is, if you're worrying about what can go wrong, chances are you will create the protections against that thing going wrong, and therefore that's good. And if you're not worrying about the things that are going to go wrong, then they'll probably, the things you never expect are going to come and hit you, okay? And so it sounds counterintuitive, If you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you better worry. But what it means is that process of, okay, go to the thing, go to it, and enjoy it. View these things as puzzles. Your personality will change. You'll enjoy it, okay? Because life is a puzzle. It's a going through the jungle. There's a life cycle, right? Your teens, your 20s, your 30s, and so on. And every phase is a little bit different, or quite a bit different. And people have asked me in their 20s, what is good advice for their 20s? And I gave that. And now I've gotten some questions of what is good advice for people in their 40s. And so I'll just pass along some thoughts. Okay, that's your midlife, you know, that in history. And when you look at happiness, that's measured as the toughest part of life. It's a midlife, they talk about midlife crisis. And it's a difficulty because you have to juggle your work and your family. And it's not just your immediate family, maybe your parents, your children. You're trying to be successful in life. And you find out maybe that life is tougher than you expected. And so that midlife crisis is the key thing. Okay, what would I recommend? First of all, I recommend for every phase of your life, meditation. If you can meditate and you have the calmness and the equanimity to look at that, I think that that's an important thing. And then I think also that if you think about the relationships that you're in, that then may be more strained, to differentiate those relationships. Who are the people that you want to be around, and how do you work with them to get you through those issues? And then on the issue of there's too much to do, you know, too much work, and think how you get leverage. Think about how you get the more out of an hour than you did before. It's all a matter of leverage. If you know how to leverage yourself well, then you're going to be able to get more life out of life. So don't think it's just a matter of a choice. I have to give up this or give up that. Think about how you can do the leverage. A lot of these things are dealt with in, you know, my book, Principles for Life and Work, so I can't cover them all. But I would say that that's the expectation. You're going to go through that, probably the challenging. Savor the joys in life, meditate, and I also think about how you prioritize and organize yourself so that you go through that in the best possible way. Life to be successful, you will not let yourself do certain things because you're just no good at them. Once you get that picture down, then you can find the paths wherever the paths are. You're open-minded. The Holy Grail of Investing. It's 3 pages long, and it explains basically this important thing, because when that epiphany happened to me and how I would do it, it changed everything. And it's so important for the average person who's listening. And let me explain why that is. Because the average person who's listening, too many people, think that they can go into this very difficult zero-sum game of betting against the consensus and be right. You know what I mean? In other words, investor says, I'm going to go in the markets, I'm going to make money.
Betting against the consensus and be right.
Right, because
Okay.
the consensus is built into the price.
Okay.
Okay? That's what's think of it as like going to a horse race, and there's handicaps. Okay? You're not going to pick the best horse, and you're not going to pick the best company. A terrible company can be a better investment than a terrific company. A terrible company can be a better investment, just like the terrible horse can be a better investment, because the odds that are changing, like you go into that becomes the long shot. But because the long shot is going to pay off 25-1, right? If he comes in, you could just as likely bet on the long shot as the leader, and it's going to be equally likely that you're going to make money, right? Otherwise the market would be doing the opposite. Well, the market is like that, right? In other words, if everybody believes that something's going to be terrific, okay, then everybody's betting on it, and its price is high. So it's not what's best necessarily. It's what's best relative to what's in the price, what's discounted. You know, everybody crashes, And then you're faced with that crash. And you either have an epiphany or you don't. You either walk off the field and say, hey, I don't want to do this anymore, and you give up on that, going after your audacious goals, or you gain really humility. You know, how do you feel that you're going to be wrong? And so I think then that whole notion is, you know, to come back with the finding the smartest people I could find who disagree with me. Also, I'm in the investment management business that you have to bet against the consensus. Otherwise you can't make money because it's in the price. And you have to bet against the consensus and be right. Or as an entrepreneur, I'm an entrepreneur. I had to bet against the consensus and be right. And so to gain that humility was the thing. So you either get off the field or you learn, right?
I hated school. I really hated school. I hated school, generally, right? Because it was this instruction following thing. Now, I bet you it's probably also because I wasn't good at it. I mean, I suspect I wasn't good at it. You know, maybe to some extent it was that, yes, I wanted to pursue the understanding. I always liked the understanding, but I think I was just built that way, right? So some people, it sticks. And some people, like I've got a great conceptual memory and a terrible rote memory. So if I have a story, I could tell you year by year kind of what happened within a story, within a context. But if I was to go into, you know, like a memory-based learning, it's terrible. I have a terrible rote memory. My situation was I did terribly in high school. I hated high school. I just wouldn't study. I would remember that, you know, my mother would send me to my room and say, you have to study. And I wouldn't study. I would refuse. I'd do anything. I would be alone in the room. I'd find something to think about or do. And I wouldn't study. And I did terrible in high school. And I barely got into a college that, C.W. Post College, which people, you know, it was just it was a great college for me at the time. And it was only then that I could begin to pick my courses. So then I began to pick things that were interesting to me. And then it was exciting. I loved it, right? And you had the free time. Like college, you know, other school, most of the time, you know, you go at a certain time, the bell rings, you go to the next class, it's packed in. In college, there was freedom. I always loved freedom. I remember when I got my car or whatever it would be, anything that brought me freedom, I loved. And so college allowed me freedom, the freedom to choose the subjects largely that I was interested in, the freedom of time. And so I did very well in college. And then I went to Harvard Business School. In the summer between college and going to Harvard Business School, I clerked on the floor of the stock exchange, which was in 1971 when there was the monetary system breakdown, and which was an unbelievable experience. And it was, well, I was wrong many times in the markets up to that, but this was one of those really telling times. So I watched it, followed developments day by day up until the breakdown. And what I was seeing is that the world financial system, money as we knew it, dollars, were not being accepted. We had large debts around the world, and these dollars were not being accepted, and a big crisis. And it came to head on August 15th, 1971, when I was clerking on the floor of the exchange. And President Nixon, on Sunday night, gets in front of the television and announces the floating of the dollar. In other words, we're going off the gold standard. And at that time, money had no value except as a claim against gold, because money was like checks in your checkbook, right? It had no value, no intrinsic value. So now there was going to be the severing of the relationship. It's like now you can keep the checks,
but you can't have the money that's in the bank. And so that, I figured, wow, what a shock. And I walked on to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange where I'm clerking, and I come there, and the stock market went up the most it ever went up in a long time, in many years. And that was the first time that happened. And I said, I wasn't prepared for the fact that this was a currency devaluation. People at the time, none of us, really understood the relationships because it never happened in our lifetimes before. So I started to do research. I always wanted to understand how it made sense, and I realized that there were currency devaluations that happened many times in history. So, for example, in 1933, in March of 1933, in the Great Depression, the same thing happened for the same reasons. There was too much debt, and they had to print money. And when you print money, you have this kind of effect. And these experiences then, all through my development, I found that there were many things that had never happened in my lifetime before, or the lifetime of the people that I was operating with, the marketplace. The people in the market mostly were very, very much responsive to their experiences, particularly their more recent experiences. So it was a pattern that I would see of surprise. We would be surprised because we were stuck in our presumption that our recent experiences were going to continue. So, picking people, that's what we're on. Tell me about it.
Well, I think that's the number one thing, is to try to get it right on the way in the door, and understanding what you need and what you're looking for. So, as we like to say, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So we try to define the path of what we're looking for in terms of the traits, the athletic qualities, the competitiveness, and so forth. By position, and to identify that, and then try to select those people that we feel like will fit into our culture and into our program, because it's so hard to change them if they don't have those qualities. It's really hard to, you can mold a little bit, but it's hard to fundamentally change selfish to unselfish, as an example. So that's really the selection part of it is really important for us on the beginning, and in our business, we start with 90 players, and then we go to 53. So 37 players get fired every year. And one of the things that I learned from Jack Welch, one of his great axioms was, treat them the same way on the way out as you treat them on the way in. You're happy to have them on the way in, you love them on the way in. It doesn't work out, you feel the same way about them on the way out. I mean, unless there's been some extraordinary circumstance, but sometimes it just doesn't work out, where you have to move on. And it's probably your fault as much as it is anybody else's, because you didn't select the right person. But in the end, we move on and treat them the same as the way in as the way out. But the selection process at the beginning really is the key to, I think, building the culture and building the organization that you.
Well, I do want to talk about my generation, the millennials. We were really coming of age during the crisis. So how would you advise us to prepare, and what would you tell our generation? We feel scarred from the crisis.
Yeah. First of all, I think one of the problems is that the experience that you had as the last experience is the one that's going to stick in your mind and probably will not be the one that's going to get you. So that the next experience will be very, very different. I know my parents went through the Great Depression, and then they missed out on the boom because they were always thinking about that. And so I think that what they need to do is see all of those crises. That's why you can see inflationary ones and see all of those. And once you get that perspective, I would say three things to your generation. Okay, three recommendations. The first recommendation is to think about your savings and how much money do you have for savings. And the best way to think about that is to think, how much money do I spend each month, and how much money do I have saved so that I can, how many months am I going to be okay without that? And to value savings, right? And calculate it, because savings in that is freedom and security, and think about what that is. So that's the first. How much do I have for that? The second thing is, how do I save well? What should I put my saving in? And when thinking about what you should put your saving in, realize that the least risk investment that you think from volatility is the least risk investment, which is cash, is the worst investment over a period of time. And you could judge that by judging the rate of inflation in relationship to the after-tax income you're going to earn. So if you have an inflation rate that's 2 or 3%, and you're earning 1%, and you have to pay taxes on that 1% or the 1 or 2% that you're going to get, you're going to get taxed essentially at 2% a year, and that's going to be a problem. So you have to move into assets that are other assets that are going to do better over a period of time. And when you do that, the most important thing I can convey to you is to diversify well. Because I can guarantee you that one of those assets, and you won't be able to pick the right one, will be disastrous in your lifetime. That you will lose half of that savings if you're in the wrong one, and you won't know what the right one is. And so pick different countries, pick different asset classes, and I could probably take too long explaining how you might do that. But so that would be the second thing to learn. First thing is think about how to save. Be cautious about debt. When you're thinking about debt, think about, is that debt going to help my savings, or is it going to produce an income? Sometimes debt, like buying a house or buying an apartment or buying an asset, it produces forced savings. Forced savings is a good thing. Or if you're taking on debt and you're thinking, am I going to have that debt in an asset? That asset better produce more income than the cost of your debt. If you're using debt for consumption, that's not a good thing to do. Okay, you're giving up that safety. So number one is think about how much you save and think about whether that should be how you borrow. Number two, make sure that you think about the diversification of that, not in cash. And number three, do the opposite of what your instincts are. If you're going to play the game, it has to be the opposite of what your instincts and the crowd says, because the market reflects the crowd. So you want to buy when no one wants to buy, and you want to sell when no one wants to sell, right? So, and that's emotionally difficult, and probably you're not going to play that game well, because it takes a lot of resources to play the game. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars each year to try to play that game well, and it's a tough game to play well. So I would caution you about the market timing game, but I would say that if you're going to do it in the ways that are uncomfortable, because they're opposite your instincts.
That's really good advice, right? One more thing that really resonated with me in the book was if in the next downturn, some of the implications could be the impact on pension obligations, healthcare. Is my generation going to be on the hook for that?
Yeah. So we pay a lot of attention to debt, and we should, but pension obligations and healthcare obligations are just like debt. They're obligations that require cash to fund those things. And when you think about that, we don't have enough money to fund those things. And so there'll be a squeeze. And I think that's also part of this political conflict, because when you say to somebody that you're not going to be able to fully fund their pension, or how are you going to fund it, what are you going to take it away from in order to fund it? Or if you think about the healthcare issues and so on with the demographics, and those require taking things away from people that have been promised to people, or do you print the money? These are issues that will be important for your generation.
And you know, not only are you an incredible money manager, but you're also a really big philanthropist. And when you're talking about the next downturn, you're also bringing up some big social issues, the wealth gap. How do you think about that? How do we address this issue? Because it sounds like it's going to be a very big problem.
Yeah, I think capitalism has got to work for all the people, and democracy's got to work for everybody. And we're in a situation right now, because of a lot of things, that it's not working for a large portion of the bottom 60%. I separated the averages to the bottom 60% and the top 40%. I could have done it the 80% or even 95%. And it's not working for a large percentage of the population. We don't have adequate education. We don't create bottoms. In many cases, my wife works in Connecticut to try to help what are called disengaged and disconnected youth. Well, give you a picture. Connecticut, which is the richest state in the country, or equal to the richest state in the country, has 22% of its high school students are disengaged or disconnected. Disengaged means they attend high school, but they don't really study, they just sort of get through. And disconnected means they don't even know where they are. 22%. Those students, those people are going to be on the street. That's a problem. There are school districts in which they have to share books, or in some cases, even have to share pencils. They literally will break a pencil in half and sharpen it from both ends, or pass it around and so on. And that issue about opportunity in terms of education or even income opportunity. There's a population that in that bottom 60% where opiate use is rising and suicides are rising. I think there has to be considered a national emergency in which we create metrics. What are those conditions? And that there should be a dealing with that. I think that these things can be dealt with much, much better, but it has to be treated in a way that that's dealt with. And that has by making them productive. I don't mean by giving money or by giving welfare, but by doing certain things, probably in private-public partnerships, in which the private sector, that could be business sector, together with the government sector, can do the checks and balances to make those things productive. I see many of these cases. I fund, for example, microfinance. Grameen America is one, but a number of those. And the capacity to lend somebody $1,000 and get paid back, not 99%, 98% payback rates. And that $1,000 can create the purchase of a rug cleaning piece of equipment, and that person's in business to be able to be productive. Those kinds of things need to be thought about, because if we don't have capitalism working for the majority of people, it's going to be threatened. And the same thing is democracy. The democracy is based on the notion of compromise, to be able to bring people together and so on. I think if we have too much fragmentation, I think that these are the biggest risks. I think debt crises can be managed, but when you get into bad situations, as a basic principle, if you have rich and poor living together, and they have to decide how they're going to spend a budget, how they divide a pie, and you have an economic downturn, you're probably going to have a conflict. And I think that has to be dealt with. What should you do if you want to be very successful and have a very, very big impact on the world? Make your work and your passion the same thing, and don't forget about the money part. But do it in a way that you're going to produce enough money that you're going to be able to have the resources to have a big impact on the world. I always think about how my actions align with my principles, and if they don't align, I either have to bring my actions in line with my principles, or my principles in line with my actions.
How do you know if a mentor is good for you? Really, it's quite simple. Do you have simpatico with that mentor, and are you learning a lot?
How do you approach the work-life balance? The key is to get more out of a day. If you can get more out of a day by leveraging yourself in a number of ways, you will get more life into a day. How can we lift up the entire global community? Just be good with each other. If you are generous and you think of the common good and so on, we would have a wonderful society. That's all we need to do.
Throughout history, there's a fight for control, because there's no world court that you go to and plead your case. And so there's a fight for power. So there's a war, and then the winners come out of that war, and the winners set the rules. And so 1945, the United States had 80% of the world's money. Gold was money at the time. It had half the world's GDP. It had a monopoly on military power.
So the US set the world order. That's why the United Nations is in New York. Washington, D.C. has the IMF and the World Bank. And its currency became the reserve currency because of that set of circumstances. Things evolve, things change over history. So the three big things that are changing now that haven't occurred in our lifetime is the amount of debt and money creation, which affects the value of money, and you could see it affecting what's going on every day. The large debt puts central bankers in a choice. Do you pay it back with hard money, or do you pay it back with printed devalued money? And if you pay it back with hard money, it's hard. In other words, that's when you have debt crises. So in all cases, they eventually print money, and that produces inflation. That's the place we are at this moment. Okay. The second is when there's a great internal conflict, usually when there's a large wealth and values gap, at the same time as you have a financial problem. Then you get populism of the left and populism of the right. In other words, those who feel disenfranchised want people who are going to fight for them. They don't want compromisers. They don't want them to be in the middle, because middle means that they're not fighting for them. They want them to have guts. So you have populists of the left, and their positions harden, and there are no compromises. That's why we're potentially in a situation that you could see in one of these elections, maybe in 2024, that neither side would accept losing. Perhaps we see that. Maybe you don't follow the rulings of the Supreme Court. Anyway, these things have not happened in our lifetime, but they happened many times in history. So if you look at that, you see from those patterns why the gaps become greater and the positions harden, and you see the dynamic. So that's the second. And the third is the rise of a great power to challenge the existing great power. In other words, I gave you the example of how the United States was so dominant in 1945. Now it's not as dominant. It is not dominant. In other words, China and the opposition is as strong as the United States and its allies. And so we have a conflict. And there are 5 kinds of wars, and they start in this order, just sequentially, typically. A trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war. Then you get into a capital and economic warfare, which we are now with sanctions. They always happened in history. And then there's a military war. And so you could see that progression happen through time. I think that there's a tendency to look at the economy in a rearview mirror, seeing low levels of inflation, and also not understanding monetary inflation. There are 2 types of inflation. There's an inflation when the demand is pressing up against the ability to produce. So we had that kind of inflation. Unemployment rates go down and there's a limit to the capacity to produce. There's also a monetary inflation. And a monetary inflation means, very simply, if you produce more money in credit, if that increase is greater than the production of the goods and services, prices will go up. It creates a spiral, which we're seeing now. In other words, the selling of bonds. So it makes the imbalance become greater, because not only do you sell the bonds to pay for the deficit governments do, but holders of bonds choose to sell bonds because they're not producing a good real return. Now that just mechanistically may be a little bit tricky for some people, but what that means is when you have a big supply-demand imbalance like that, either interest rates have got to go up to curtail that demand, or the central bank has to print more money, and they always print more money. So that dynamic of monetary inflation, the type of thing that makes the 70s, or the type of thing that makes inflationary depressions like happened in the Weimar Republic in Germany in the early 1920s, that kind of inflation I don't think is paid enough attention to. Inevitably, there's a certain amount of debt that has to be paid. And one man's debts are another man's assets. And the more debt you have, the bigger the problem is. And so when you have a lot of debt and you have to pay it back, you're either going to pay it back in hard money, or you're going to pay it back in depreciated money. And that becomes the choice of the central bank. That's why you get stagflations. That's why we have an environment like we have now. You have economic weakness.
But what can the individual do, and just to summarize, the collective do, to stop or slow the decline that clearly you can measure has occurred?
First, financially, be financially strong. Have a good income and balance sheet, income statement and balance sheet. Think about how many months or years that you could live if you were if you didn't have an income. The more financial security you have, the more maneuverability you have, both to protect yourself on the downside and to take advantage of opportunities, and to know how to achieve a balanced portfolio. This is very important, I think, financially. And then be with people, your community. The source of happiness, psychologists have studied that above a basic level, income is not a source of happiness. Community is the highest ranked source of happiness. So how you work well with others. So I think meaningful work and meaningful relationships, to be productive and to also have the joy of those relationships, I think is of paramount importance. And then also to realize what the risks are. That's why I wrote them in the book. The risks of like, can you, well, there are many kind of risks. And do you understand those risks? And where are you? And where do you live? What are those risks like? To recognize that the world is domestically and internationally breaking into different ideologies and different economic systems, really. That happens state by state as well as around the world. And to understand which are the places that are the best for you in those set of circumstances, to be aware of those risks. You have a stagnant economy, low growth, and with high inflation. And that happens through this monetary situation that I'm describing, in which the central bank tries to deal with a middle course. In other words, what does the central bank want? Not too high inflation and not too low growth. And so when there's a lot of debt, because one man's debts are another man's assets, it becomes very difficult, a balancing act. And that is when you have stagflation, when you produce it. So just like in the 1960s, late 60s, we spent a lot of money on guns and butter, we called it, right. The Vietnam War, social programs and so on. We wrote too many checks relative to the money we had in the bank, which was gold at the time. 1971, the devaluation. Then they print a lot of money into that stagflation. So stagflation is the middle course when there's two different. So think about it this way. How does he literally fight inflation? Because everybody says tight money policies, and how do you fight inflation? The way that happens is you get people to spend less by taking money and credit away from them. Right. So he will reduce the amount of money and credit that's available. The Federal Reserve is going to sell $1.1 trillion of debt that it has, debt assets, bonds. Right. And then they're going to raise interest rates. So they create a squeeze that reduces demand at the same time as people don't have enough money because inflation is high. The buying power is less. And then what that act is to reduce buying power again to reduce inflation, but it comes at a big cost, and that is stagflation. I want to explain inflation in a very simple way. There's a certain amount, quantity of buying, that is of how much money and credit you're given, divided by the amount of quantity of goods and services sold. In other words, if there's a lot more money and credit produced than there is goods and services produced, you will have an inflation, and the magnitude will be a function of that ratio. Over that period of time, there was a very enormous amount of money and credit that was produced, and there were some bottlenecks and shortages of production and disruption because of mostly of a combination of COVID and also geopolitical issues. Yeah. So there was some effect. Most of the inflation came from the production. We attribute it. We can go down to actually calculate it. Most of that was due to the enormous increase in money and credit and spending that was produced. If you now look at the United States, it's no longer dominant militarily. It's no longer dominant economically because China has become comparable and is a larger trading partner with other countries than the United States is, the amount of trade and so on. It's a very unique power. Think about it. You can print the money that the world will accept. Now that means when they accept it, they buy your bonds, they buy your debt. That's what they hold these in, which are promises to receive this currency that you could print. So there are two things now that are jeopardizing that position. Dollar's now strong, but there are two things, we want to hold on to that position. Two things that threaten it. First is the printing and devaluing money, but all countries right now are doing it. So in all countries, currencies are depreciating against goods and services prices. And then the other issue, which is interesting, is the weaponization of the dollar in the form of sanctions. America is certainly in relative decline. In other words, has been. Education is not the same. Military power is not the same. Economic power is not the same. If we're looking at, how we're behaving with each other, it is not the same. This is the question. All currencies, usually during these period of time, depreciate together. So in the 1930s, all the currencies depreciate. They depreciated then against gold. they depreciate against assets, against real estate prices and a number of things. But we're coming into a new world in which the real question is what will be the new currency? And it may not be just a government currency. Is it crypto? Is it gold? Is it other things? And we'll find out. So a currency is a medium of exchange, and we'll have all of those currencies continue to be, including the dollar. But it's also a storehold of wealth. And that means that the bonds, or what you store it in, has to have a real return. And none of the major currencies have that. That's why you're seeing movements out of all of those and into other assets, and why you're seeing the bond market sell off. The production is now going based on ideological and political considerations. In other words, I talked about self-sufficiency. If you look at China will be self-sufficient. The United States will be self-sufficient. Multinational companies are going to worry about where they're going to have trade and so on. So the notion of how do I deal with self-sufficiency? We're in a world where ideological and political forces are allocating resources more than economic. Given the risks in the world, they want to be self-sufficient. And similarly, the United States wants to be more self-sufficient, and other countries are wanting to be more self-sufficient because they're worried about being cut off. It's the nature of the beast. Capitalism is a fabulous way of allocating resources to get rich, but it gets people at different rates. They get very big differences, and also produces a lot of debt. That's part of the capitalist process. And so when there's this large debt and when there's a large wealth gap, people feel disenfranchised. So it happened in Europe, 4 major democracies chose autocracies because of the fight between the left and the right. Then they called it fascism and communism. But those two, the right and the left, and how to deal with it has always happened. So you go back to the French Revolution. In all of those cases, there were moderates. There were people in the middle who said we have issues and we have to deal with those types of issues. But the polarity becomes greater. When the causes that people are behind are more important to them than the system is in jeopardy. You know how it is. How did Donald Trump get elected? What was the characteristics of the population? You can go back and you could see that. So you have fighters on both sides who
do not want to compromise.
They don't want, it's considered weak. And if you're in the middle, you will have to pick a side and fight. There's the loss of the middle. What we need right now, in my opinion, is a strong middle. You need a strong middle, but you also have a political system where you have 2 parties. And because of those 2 parties, there's a tendency to become more and more extreme because those extremities on each part of their party become stronger so to win a nomination. Measures of extremism is that, roughly speaking, about 30% of the population is rather extreme of the right, and about 15% is extreme of the left. Of course, that represents then the majority of the Republican Party is in that category, and then a very important part of the Democratic Party is
on the left.
Yet the majority of Americans are
in the middle.
So you still have, given those numbers, they add up to maybe 40 or 45% of the population. But we don't have a party in the middle. You don't have a middle. Investing in education and infrastructure through history have been the most important ingredients. You can't make better investments than in education and infrastructure. They pay and they produce a more broad-based prosperity. But we don't do that because of certain reasons, the Constitution and the like. But in order to do that, you need a platform of the middle. You need a spokesman, I think, that draws people away from the extremes toward the middle. If you did have a third political party, and I'm not saying that's practical, but I would say then you could have a platform, and then you could have somebody that you could look at, or candidates that say, I am for the middle, and that would help to neutralize. Because otherwise, history has shown you go to greater and greater extremism, and then you have the battle. And I think that that's what we should be afraid of most, is that those extremists in a battle having a type of civil war, which I think there's a reasonable chance of. When I say a civil war, I think that the rule of law and constitution can be of diminished value relative to power, such as in the elections, neither side accepting losing, such as the Supreme Court makes rulings that are not followed by states, such as population moving from one state to another because the values in that other state are more there. And so then it becomes a make me type of situation. Rather than saying, what is the law? It says, make me do that thing. And now when we lose that kind of rule of law and respect for the whole, I think that's a type of civil war. When you watch that, who knows where that leads? It could lead to violence. The whole idea in the Constitution of holding arms, and how many, there are more arms than there are people, and so on. And when you get into a make-me mentality, you could get into an armed situation where a lot of people and guns and crazy things. I'm not going that far, but I'm saying could. Let's bring that back a notch and talk about, can we imagine, you and I, we know history, and we look at today, and it's different. Could we see the failure of following the rule of law and the Constitution? So somebody gets elected and you now know who's going to be in the seat, or you don't follow that and you get into a power-based situation? Yes, there's a possibility. And the fact that we consider that to be a significant possibility, I put the odds of something like that at about 40%. History has also shown, and we see it, that people have to pick a side. They pick a side and they speak to it. So you watch in the media. Do you get unbiased reporting? It's hard to come by. Even exchanges of thoughts. It wasn't like this. Even the issue, let's say, of Disney in Florida. In the past, each could have a different perspective. You wouldn't weaponize. You wouldn't retaliate to the same extent that we're retaliating with exercises of power and so on. You have to benefit the majority of the people. It's narrowing just by any of the measures since 1980. Per capita income for the bottom 60% of the population has not risen. If you ask your surveys, it's a failure. Every system needs to be improved and modified and made better. And I'm a mechanic, so I just look at the cause-effect relationship. It is because there is an element in which the reinvestment of gains do not go down to create the basics. What are the basics? Here's all you need. Parents who will take good care of you, a good public education system, and equal opportunity. That's all you need, as existed throughout history. You give those things to people, and by and large, you have a much more prosperous, you could draw the talent from wherever it is. So those are the things. And we're in a spiral, because also the children who grow up in some of these areas from childhood, and they don't have the parents, they don't have the circumstances in terms of the basic equal education and so on. And that population is a growing population. And so we see then the disenfranchised. Other issues is because that population. So let's just go back. How did Donald Trump get elected as president? There was a population that was a disenfranchised population that wanted somebody who was going to fight for him, like populists do. The profit system alone is not good enough. The history of these situations make one worry about such things because the conflict and so on goes through a difficult time. I believe that we're at a moment in which we have a choice, and it largely depends on how we are with each other.
We being Americans.
Americans, and then we being, it could be Americans and Chinese, but we as humans have a choice of how we are going to be with each other. The world has more resources than it has ever had. It has more wealth than it has ever had. It has inventiveness that will produce fabulous gains, and that'll continue. But the issue is really, are we going to be dealing with that as a together society? It's very simple.
We've spent a lot of time over the last 2 days in this room talking about really some pretty remarkable effects that AI in particular is having on how companies are thinking about their path forward. As an investor, how significant, and as an economic historian, how significant is this technology revolution?
Oh, I think it's hugely significant, and I'm not just starting on it. I found, like 25 years ago, I started writing down my principles in words, and then they became encoded in algorithms. We built systems, decision-making, computerized decision-making systems, and there was a great power, and I've watched the whole arc of this, and I know the power. It is stupid, it is archaic for people to think that decision-making just in their heads is going to be good. There has to be a partnership between what's in your heads and what the computer does, because it's so much powerful in so many other ways. So I think it's part of the whole evolutionary process. Don't go to war with each other, work together, right? Don't go to war. If you do that and you realize we're all in this together, and then I don't care how you get there in terms of that element. I do believe in thoughtful disagreement, of the art of thoughtful disagreement. I believe in win-win relationships, not lose-lose relationships. And my principle is, if you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you need to worry.
You need to worry.
Because if you worry, you will do the things that prevent you from happening the thing you're worrying about. So, for example, if I look at the term civil war and I look at the term international war, I don't trust and I can paint a picture, a realistic picture of what that looks like, so the people really see it, like the people who went through those wars in history saw it. If I can paint that picture and then say one thing we can agree on is we don't want that. Okay, we do not want that. So how? That's why I would like to see in the United States, I'd like to see us get strong. I'd like to see a strong middle. Anybody who has gone through a war, this is true for history, you see what happens is the polarity becomes so great that there's no talking. There's just mutual intimidation and there's a fight. And you get beyond the stage and the middle gets lost.
I've never
There's the
heard
capacity,
that one before.
a lot of capacity to increase the size of the pie and divide it better. And I'm a capitalist, so I don't mean just handing out money wastefully, but I mean there's so many opportunities to improve productivity and produce opportunity in various ways that I just can't believe that we're not doing it, and we could do it.
You point out in the book that often a rising power and a declining power, where they cross, end up in a war. Do you believe China and the United States are going to end up in a war?
I believe that there's a significant risk of it, but I don't think it's probable. As I say, well, there are 5 types of wars. We're in 4 of them,
Right.
and we're at the edge of a 5th.
Which is a shooting war.
That's right. So we are in a trade war, we are in a technology war, we are in a geopolitical influence war, and we are to some extent a capital and economic war. We are there. And we are dealing with military issues, particularly as they pertain to Taiwan. We're close.
Could Taiwan be the thing that led us to war?
If we go to a military war, it'll almost certainly be the Taiwan issue. I think we want to contain China. Their concerns are mostly the domestic concerns. How do they deal with the demographics issue? How do they deal with their own domestic issues? You know, when you run a country, the major issues are the internal issues. How do you make sure you deal with corruption? How do you deal with all the issues that they face? Poverty in the east, in the western part of China, environmental issues, the property bubble that's bursting, the COVID issue. So look at it this way, it's a big thing. The population in China, the capitas, are more than 4 times that in the United States. Since I started going to China in 1984, per capita income has increased by 27 times. If it increased to half of what the United States is, that would mean its economy would be twice the size of the United States. So it's a big force. The main reason that China did not denominate its exports and trade in the currency and did not denominate its lending is that they didn't want to be a threat to the United States, because that's a threatening act. If the United States loses, now we were in a different era then, just to explain it. They became the largest trading country in the world. In other words, did more trade than any other. They could have operated in their currency. In terms of lending, international lending, they're the largest lenders, and they could have done that in their currency. They chose not to because they perceived that that would be a threat. They were not trying to disrupt the world order. But now we have a different set of circumstances worldwide. This leadership was the same, of the same mind. And I think is pretty much today, they don't want to disrupt the world order, but they want to be as great as they can be. They want to be as rich and powerful and so on, but they don't want to disrupt the world order. If you look at history and you understand international relations, which is very much like Confucianism, what you have is called a tribute system. And that means each country is in the place, they know their place. They know the hierarchy. Like in the old days, it's almost like other countries would be almost a vassal state. You would say, I know that you have the power, you pay respect, and you operate in a harmonious way. But the idea of war is a horrendous idea. So I think that they would probably be just as happy if you divided the world in half, their half and we had our half, and there was peace in the world. I'm just saying an objective is not to dominate the world. An objective is to operate in a way where there is no such war. However, that they are as strong and powerful and healthy and prosperous as they can be. I think it's very difficult for a lot of Americans who hold close to them the treasured, I live the American dream, I know equal opportunity, I know the ability to speak up, I know that those types of values, but it's difficult for other Americans to understand why they have a different point of view about what works better. A very good example of a cultural case. I think it was the NBA team, an individual spoke out on Hong Kong, and the Chinese not only punished that team, but they punished the NBA. And in our, like I would say, everyone should have the right to their opinions and to be able to have free expression. In their view, if somebody's doing something wrong, that they will punish the group. They'll punish the family because the group is supposed to be responsible for that. They don't understand it from the internal values way having to do with Confucianism, the history, why it's more autocratic, top-down, what they believe about democracy.
The Chinese leadership is paranoid mostly about maintaining the power of the Communist Party.
Well, they would view that as very similar to us saying the power of the Constitution, because that is the system, that's the order. In 1949, they made a system, and that's the system. When we think of party, we think of that same multiple party type of thing. They think of it as very top-down, very hierarchical, and it's like the family. Vice President of China, Wang Qishan, described it to me. He said, it's top-down, Americans are bottom-up. And the question is, by the way, we have this issue, are we fighting for that ideology? These are bigger questions. Are we fighting for a democracy and capitalism? Or do we believe that others can find their own approaches and may the best approach win out? That becomes a big question as we pursue it. So that is their approach, may not be my approach. They will not give that approach up any more than Americans would give up the Constitution, let's say, or their freedom of speech up. So we just have to understand it's like a religion. You know, as we have different religions all around the world, they're deeply held beliefs, and each believes in that they're going to get the right outcomes by pursuing them. And what do you do about that?
There's also the question of human rights. And clearly, the Chinese have a different view than a lot of people around the world. How do you approach that?
Well, there's me and there's every one of us. It's a cosmic question. Every one of us who buys products, or all the businesses that are operating and interacting with China or operating in many countries, I could list a number of countries, the interconnectedness of the relationships with China. We import 22% of our manufactured goods comes from China. If you're buying your Apple or you're buying your sneakers, you're in a position that's somewhat similar to me in terms of thinking about what the issues are. What I do is I rely on the guidance of the government, both governments. I think in studying their dynasties, I studied the Tang dynasty, which is around 600, and I studied also other societies. It is the things that I've talked about before. It is in broad-based education. That Confucian system was the first meritocracy that came in to create broad-based education, and then they would have exams, and the people who would get the jobs would be the people who were the most capable, and they got away from corruption and those types of things. I wouldn't characterize some things as Chinese. I think that in the history of China, there have been good dynasties and there have been bad dynasties, but there's always the common ingredients of what makes a country successful, and they've been that way uniquely. If you do look at the history, I've studied the powers and the different strengths. China has hit through history up until around 1840, been always like number one or two in the country because of hard work, because of meritocracy, because of being highly civilized. In other words, they are working in the same direction and they operate well to be productive together. Those are the same elements, but it's not just Chinese. If you go back to many empires and many civilizations, those elements have been the timeless and universal elements that have been the source of success. But of course, there's always a balance between being a revolutionary. It's always how far do you take it? So in China right now, there's entrepreneurship, investing in all the ways, empowering, and it's really a capitalist type of approach among entrepreneurship, but they'll call it state capitalism, that kind of an approach. And then there's the question of order. So it is always in getting that balance correctly, because you can have disorder. Like in the United States, we could have enough disorder that could be disruptive to that process. So it's always the issue of getting that balance right. Right now, I think the tilt in China has been a bit more autocratic. And so they're trying to strike this balance with also creating what they call Little Giants program for entrepreneurship and so on. I think it's become too much that way. And I think just in the United States, we're becoming a little disorderly.
Is there any dissent in China?
Oh, dissent? There's not the same kind of open dissent as there is in the United States in terms of how people can speak as freely, nor the media speaking freely, or even listening to things. No. Dissent is more under the surface, particularly now. The leadership evolved greatly also by the circumstances. When he first came to power about 9 years ago, there were two big issues. Corruption, and that the system, 5 major banks lent to state-owned enterprises and local governments, and there was no capital market for small, medium-sized businesses and entrepreneurship. And so if you take on the progress they made tremendous progress along those lines. They now have capital markets, and they've done a tremendous job of reducing.
In a country which is ruled by the Communist Party.
Right, but in their way of doing it, which is that it's run like a company, sort of. There's a board and they operate that way. But in that time, there was a move toward more, at first, 2 5-year terms. So when they moved into the second 5-year term, because of infighting, there was this, what they call core management. So there are 7 standing members of the Politburo, and 4 of them became more the allies of Xi Jinping. And there is a belief that they're going into a more challenging environment. And then they had this series of challenging, and it's become more autocratic than it was before, more nationalistic. I would say they feel more threatened, and it's created more nationalism. So we've begun this dynamic where it's no longer a win-win relationship. It's more like a chess game. In other words, where do you put the pressures on? We're in a war. The power of man, it's in man's hands to be able to work well together and to come up with the inventiveness. If we did those things well, I'm not worried at all. The acts of nature being such a dominant thing, I didn't know that, and then I saw that. There are charts in that book that shows life expectancy, shows per capita GDP, and seeing that these things would last, maybe they're 10 years, maybe they're 5 to 10 years, really terrible wars and so on, but they don't kill most people, and most people get through them one way or another, and then they pass, and then you move on to a higher living standard. And so that arc just always keeps coming up because of man's adaptability and inventiveness. The power of that also came through loud and clear, and that's why I keep coming back to the point that man has that power, and also it just comes down to using that power and being good with each other. It very much depends on the people too, that the people play an important role. The dynamic between what the people allow or demand of their leaders is very important. It's not just the leader, but what I learned about leadership was good leadership varied according to the time and the circumstances that existed. So for example, Adenauer, who was one of the great leaders in Henry's point of view, what came about after a country lost a war, and it required a certain type of great man for that particular time. And so as time changed and circumstances change, the definition of what a great leader changes, but a great leader, in any case, understands the circumstances and has the vision to carry that forward, and that there's a dynamic with the population. And so can you get the population behind you even when it's a disorderly population? That becomes the great question. Can there be great leadership?
Unbalanced, having really looked at dynasties and looked at history and examined it and looked for the lessons, and think about the moment we are in at this moment. I'm thinking primarily the United States. Optimistic or pessimistic?
Concerned.
Sure.
It goes back to the point before. I would say I would be more pessimistic than optimistic, but I believe the power is in the population. If they find a strong middle, if they work together. 1971, I was clerking on the floor of the stock exchange, and Nixon got on television on Sunday night, and I watched him tell the country and tell the world that the promise to take paper dollars and turn them in for gold was going to be defaulted on. And I was shocked. Never experienced that in my lifetime. I went on the floor of the stock exchange. I thought it would go down a lot. It went up a lot. I was wrong. So I studied history, and the exact same thing happened on March 5th, 1933 by Roosevelt doing it over the radio, the exact same thing. And so that taught me that I needed to do that. Of course, I needed to study the Great Depression. I needed to study the 1929 to 33 period. And it happened in exactly the same way. Exactly. A debt crisis when you hit 0 interest rates and the Federal Reserve couldn't ease anymore. And I saw that. And for the first time since then, in 2008, the Federal Reserve printed a lot of money and bought a lot of financial assets. I would not have understood that if I didn't understand that 1929 to 33 period. So I learned the lesson, but I like to do it as though I'm going through the real experience. I like to not read history in retrospect, but read the papers as things are transpiring and imagine that I'm going through it. So elements, I think, of a currency that I think that are important is, can you buy and sell things all around the world with it? Is it going to be private currency, that you're not dependent on others? Like gold, one of the things about gold is it has intrinsic value. So because of that, it's perceived intrinsic value, but you're not looking for a payment for somebody. Whereas in others, you have to have money coming in some exchange, that the government can't control it. And we're in an environment now when you have a currency that's a threat. It's so good that it's a threat to the existing currency. Governments will outlaw it, and they have done that with Bitcoin in a number of places, including China. And I think that they have those vulnerabilities, the digital currencies, they have that. I have a tiny bit of it. There's always something new, and I really need to experience it. I need to learn about it, and I never know for sure that that's not the one that's going to be there. So I have a little bit in the portfolio. Because when you start to think about what are the currencies that have those qualities I'm talking about, that you can keep them, that you can go around the world and so on, what are they? They are